Today on the Diggin' Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Chris McKinny, Associate Professor of Biblical Archaeology at Lipscomb University, Senior Staff Archaeologist at the Tel Burna Project in Israel, co-host of the Biblical World Podcast, and the on-screen host of the upcoming documentary Legends of the Lost Ark. Dr. McKinny has spent over a decade digging in the dirt of ancient Judah, and his research has uncovered something that most scholars have been getting wrong for generations. The archaeological evidence at Beth Shean, the city where the Philistines displayed Saul's body after his death at Mount Gilboa, has been misread. And that misreading has caused us to miss one of the most intricate and powerful literary motifs running through the entire narrative of 1 Samuel. Dr. McKinny calls it a tale of two swords. And once you see it, the story of Saul's fall and David's rise, you will never read this the same again. You have two kings, two swords, one throne, and an archaeological correction that rewrites how we understand the biblical author's genius. Now, it's time to dig in. Welcome, everybody, to the Dig In Podcast. I am your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today, our guest, Dr. Chris McKinny. Dr. McKinny, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Johnny, for having me on.
It's my pleasure. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's just jump into our conversation. So, Dr. McKinny, before we get into Saul's death, set the stage for us. What was the geopolitical world of ancient Israel actually like during Saul's reign, and why does geography matter so much for understanding the story?
Yeah, so I mean, if we think of the story of Saul, Saul himself is just this really kind of seminal figure in the Israelite monarchy. I mean, he's the one that seems to have all the things you would want. He's tall. I like to think of him as Saul the Tall. You know, he's from his shoulders upward. Stronger than everyone else. He's wealthy. He's a landowner. He's got these donkeys that he's plowing with. He can fight battles. And yet he's missing this kind of ingredient that's required that the biblical text calls a man after God's own heart, which I would even call, just basic cowardice in some different passages. Excuse me. But overall, I think that if we then compare that to what we see from an archaeological and a geographical perspective, we see that Saul and David's different kingdoms are largely the same. Excuse me, clear my throat a little bit.
All good.
They're largely the same kind of geographical areas. I mean, we're talking about the highlands in and around Benjamin, north of Jerusalem. David, of course, seems to be primarily in the south in Judah, but they're in the general same vicinity, and they deal with the same threats, which are primarily the Philistines in the west, maybe some local nomadic peoples in the south that the biblical text calls the Amalekites, and then various other peoples that surround them, like the Ammonites and so on. And so as we think about Saul's death, all of this seems to be hurtling towards this major region, the region of the Jezreel Valley, which is where most of the story takes place.
So Mount Gilboa is where everything falls apart for Saul. What is it about this specific location that made it so strategically significant? And why would a final battle between Israel and the Philistines take place there?
Yeah. So this is actually a really big debate. As to why this particular area is mentioned in the text. And this goes back to how we think about the emergence of early Israel, and if we would actually see either Saul or David active in the Jezreel Valley. If we think before this, in the days of Joshua, the Israelites are not able to drive out the Canaanites who live in the plains of the Jezreel Valley, in the plains of Beth Shean. The same thing is true in the time of the Judges, that they're not able to drive these particular peoples out. It's read about in Judges chapter 1. So Beth Shean, Jezreel Valley, Megiddo area, all of this was an international zone that was dominated first in the preceding period by the Egyptians. This is where there are strong Egyptian city-states, and including garrisons at Beth Shean. And then as we shift from the Egyptians pulling out at the into the 12th century or so, and we, I guess, have the emergence of Canaanites again, or maybe they're Israelites, we don't really know. There's no like definite moment where it says, okay, now we're going from Egyptians ruling over Canaanites to now we have Israelites ruling over Canaanites, or what's going on in the background. So the question then becomes, if Israel is then emerging as this important territorial state that we know it does over time, either that's in the 11th and 10th century, as traditionally has been suggested, or as Israel Finkelstein and others have said, no, this only happens at the end of the 10th century and into really the 9th century that this happens, which is how the shift from a kind of a historical perspective for Saul and David moves over to Omri and Ahab. I tend to think it makes a lot of sense that it would happen earlier from this perspective. So, but in any case, a move to Mount Gilboa in the Jezreel Valley from just strictly a political perspective, a strategic perspective, the land of Israel is mostly defined by north-south regions. The coast, which is easy to traffic. The Shvela, which is more or less easy to traffic, especially east-west. The hills are really a barrier. This is where Judah is located. This is where Israel is located. And then, of course, as we move further east, we have the wilderness and then the Jordan Valley. And then climbing up, we have Transjordan, where the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites are.
Right.
So the two great traffic routes to go throughout this country are on the coast, what we call the International Coastal Highway, and then the King's Highway in the far east. However, the best places you want are the ones that bisect or cross and connect those two great routes. And the only place that really does that very well is the Jezreel Valley. So from a political standpoint, it's really the junction point of the two great roads of the land of Canaan, of really the entire land bridge that makes up the region of the southern Levant. And so, even though the text doesn't say that this is why Saul is there, again and again and again throughout history, we see people coming to the region of the Jezreel Valley. But then that gives us a even a bigger question: is, well, what are the Philistines doing there? Because the Philistines don't they don't belong there. They belong in the south, in the area south of Tel Aviv, and places like Ashdod, and Ashkelon, and Gath, and Ekron. So, in this case, we have some important historical questions we have to ask about the entire event and why the Philistines are there. But if we think about the larger geopolitical reasons, it's pretty clear that everyone is going to want to control the Jezreel Valley, which is where Mount Gilboa is located.
So walk us through what actually happened at the Battle of Mount Gilboa. What do we know historically? What do we know historically and textually about how this battle unfolded and why Israel lost?
Yeah, so the battle itself is, I think, really one of the high points in the biblical narrative, because it's the only time where we have like a modern novel where you go back and forth between different points of view in the biblical text. So the whole point of the narrative is really to illustrate that Saul is going to die, and he's going to die as far away from David as possible. So the significance is, of course, we want to read this exciting narrative about Saul's death and David's emergence, but that David is as far removed from the stink of this death, because David is going to be the one to emerge as, of course, the next ruler. So we have this back and forth from chapters 27 through 31 at the end of 1 Samuel, where it's David, then it's Saul, then it's David again, then it's Saul. So David is incrementally getting further to the south in the area of the Amalekites in Ziklag, whereas Saul is slowly making his way to the farthest northern extremity in the area of Gilboa. And so if we focus on Saul, again, we're not told necessarily why this is happening. It seems to just be, people are fighting battles with the Philistines. The Philistines are always this enemy. He's fought them in Benjamin, at the very beginning in 1 Samuel 13 and 14. He's fought them in the Elah Valley in the Shephelah. This is 1 Samuel 17, the Battle of David versus Goliath. And he's neglected them while he's been running he's been on the chase of David. And so now he has to leave David off to hide among the Philistines, and he needs to take up the fight once more. And that just so happens to be in the Jezreel Valley. And so this is an important point to remember, is we don't get the story from Saul's point of view, from the reason why Saul would do this. We get it from, well, David is the one who's doing all of these, and it's his story. And so it's kind of almost tangential to the larger geopolitical reasoning, but we can kind of infer that from the broader text. Now, and this is where I think the part of the story gets really interesting, because what ends up happening is Saul, he's facing off with the Philistines. Specifically, we're told he is at the site of Jezreel, the area of the city of Jezreel, famous in later biblical narrative for its connection with Ahab and Jezebel and Naboth's vineyard. And he doesn't really know what to do. He's now in a situation where for many months, maybe even years, he has no ability to go before the Lord. And this reminds us, going all the way back to 1 Samuel chapter 3, when Samuel has become this seer. He falls asleep inside of the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant is. He gets revelation, vision from the Lord saying, all these things are going to happen. And so Samuel becomes this touchstone for the leaders of Israel to consistently go to ask for direction. Samuel has lost that. Saul has lost that. Samuel says, I'm not going to see you anymore. And he doesn't, and he dies. And so Saul is just in this constant state of indecision, coupled by his own cowardice. And so he's standing off with the Philistines, with the Philistines on one side of the valley, and himself on the other side of the valley, very similar to what we read in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Philistines seem to be near the area of Shunem, which actually is itself a reduplication of the great story of Gideon, with the Midianites in the same kind of battle formation in the same valley, the Harod Valley, the branch off of the Jezreel Valley. And so Saul sneaks behind them on the hill of Moreh, where the Philistines are, to a place called Endor. Endor, which is, I guess, where George Lucas got the name for the moon for Star Wars. He's there, and he knows that there is a witch or a medium at Endor, and he secretly has her try to communicate with the dead. And of course, Samuel's ghost spirit emerges, and Samuel's very surprised, and Saul's very surprised. The witch is very surprised that Saul is there. And Samuel's only response to Saul is, hey, listen, tomorrow you'll be with me, you and your sons. And so Saul eats his last meal prepared for him by the witch. He hightails it back, and again he has to go back again behind enemy lines back to his camp. And then the next morning, the battle does not go well. They fight in the battle, and the Philistines seem to have come up to the area of Saul's camp. The archers find him. He's wounded, and right at the moment where he is told that the Philistines are about to have him and abuse his body, he tells his bodyguard, kill me, so they won't abuse me. And the bodyguard refuses to do so, and Saul falls on his own sword. And this is a really critical moment in the narrative. And I'll come back to it in a second. But what happens next is a real mystery in terms of interpretation, because we're told then that Saul's armor is taken, he's beheaded, and that his bodies, as well as the bodies of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the three oldest sons of Saul, leaving Ishbaal or Ishbosheth as the heir. They're also killed, and their bodies are hung somewhere. And this is really where the idea of the tale of two swords comes into play, because it's really clear that the text is saying that the bodies are hung on the site of Beit Shean, which is the nearby site, but it's not necessarily clear what happens to Saul's head and what happens to Saul's armor, which of course would have included his sword, which he has just fallen upon. And this is the part of the story where I have made a new suggestion, which is actually an old suggestion, about what happens with Saul's armor, his sword, and his head. But just to go back for just a second and say, it's really critical that we understand that Saul's suicide on his own sword is the culmination of a narrative approach to demonstrating that David has been protected all throughout this narrative. Anytime there's been an opportunity for Saul to kill him, the javelin goes to the side, or David receives some means of providence that God is protecting him. And David has said, it's not for me to kill the Lord's anointed. Maybe he will fall by the enemy or by some other means fall by the sword, but it will not be by my hand. And so this moment when Saul makes this fateful decision, you can hear just kind of the footsteps of doom on the whole thing leading to that point. And it's just, I think, a really, really powerful moment, regardless of how we interpret what happens to his remains afterwards. It's really, I think, one of the peak heroic, epic pieces of biblical literature that we have. And of course, David's response. So
Right.
just to frame the setup, and then I'll shut up for a second. The question really I have is, what happens to Saul's armor and his head? Does it go to Beit Shean with the rest of his body and the bodies of his sons that are hung on the walls of Beit Shean? Or does it go somewhere else? And then a second question related to that is, why Beit Shean? Who is at Beit Shean? And how does that factor into the narrative? But I'll stop there and see if you have any questions or comments about
Yeah,
what
no, amazing explanation, but you must be prophetic at some point, because my next two questions are going to be
Okay.
why Beit Shean? What is the city? Why did it matter to the Philistines? And then I know this is where your research gets quite interesting, and you've argued that scholars have misinterpreted the archaeological evidence at Beit Shean. So what exactly did they get wrong? So that would be my next two-parter, I guess.
Yeah. So this, I think, is one of the best examples of how biblical archaeology can shed light on ancient stories, but it can also, if we are too intent on our own particular interpretation, it can really lead us astray. I often am, I get these questions a lot, biblical archaeology, how does it affirm your faith? And I think in general, it affirms the reality that these stories are grounded and rooted in a real place and real time. But oftentimes, what people are fighting about is not actually the text versus the material. It is the interpretation of the text versus the material. And scholars, of course, have to interpret the text like anyone else. And so when the initial excavations took place at Beit Shean, of course, it's in early days of archaeology in the 1920s, 1930s, and they found amazing things. They found an Egyptian garrison. They found temples related to the earlier parts of the Iron Age too, in fact. And what they suggested is that because Samuel, 1 Samuel 31, and its parallel in Chronicles, because each of these mention a god or goddess connected with where Saul's head is brought and his armor is brought, that we therefore should read the texts as both independent witness to two temples, Canaanite temples, that were at the site that that Saul's body was brought to. And so, which is totally illegitimate from even how we should read the text, because the text itself, one says Dagon, the other one says Ashtaroth. So we have two temples at Beit Shan. This is the temple of Ashtaroth. This is the temple of Dagon, according to the archaeological interpretation. But we can't really do that because they're synoptic, like the synoptic gospels are. And so one has to be right or more reflective of an ancient tradition. We may have some corruption going on, or maybe, it was the temple of Dagon and Ashtaroth, the same one, but it has to only be one particular building. And
Gotcha.
Even more important than related to which particular deity it was, and if that reflects in the narrative, the text actually doesn't say that the head and the armor was taken to Beit Shan, but instead says it was taken to the land of the Philistines. And this gets back to that bigger question: what is going on with Beit Shan? Why is Beit Shan in the story at all? And so, because of this interpretation, people began to say that the reason why the Philistines are there is they've taken over the Jezreel Valley, and that Beit Shan itself was a kind of Philistine outpost, at least for this brief moment of time. And the Philistine temples which are there were conquered, and this is where the Philistines were living. And this is why when they defeat Saul, they bring it to Beit Shan because this belongs to them. But the text doesn't say that at all. All the text says is that the bodies were hung on the walls of Beit Shan, but the head and the armor were taken back to the land of the Philistines. And anytime you have that phrase, land of the Philistines, it's indicative of the particular region associated with their territorial homeland, like the land of Israel and so on. So once you see that, even without I think the wider story about the tale of two swords, we need to conclude that the head of Saul and then his armor was taken to Philistia. It doesn't say specifically where. I tend to think it's most likely Gath of the Philistines, but we can talk about that in a minute. So to close off this loop about Beit Shan, we can't really say with certainty what is going on with Beit Shan, other than to say that both the archaeology and the text seem to indicate that the site was a Canaanite site. Perhaps by this point it is an Israelite site, but it's hard to even distinguish between Canaanite and Israelite in this period. So we're kind of just grasping at straws.
Right.
We do know that later on in the narrative, right after this, the men of Jabesh Gilead, which is just across the Jordan Valley, where Saul's maternal lineage is from, if you remember back in Judges chapter 19 through 21, when the men of Gibeah commit that heinous crime, and just when they're about to wipe out the Benjaminites, they go to Jabesh Gilead and they kill all their men and then take the women so that they can marry and save the Benjaminites. So this seems to be clearly connected with Saul's ancient heritage. And early on in the narrative, he saves the city of Jabesh Gilead, going back to an earlier part of 1 Samuel. And so Jabesh Gilead seems to be an Israelite site, but the question of Beit Shan kind of still remains. And from an archaeological perspective, there is almost no evidence of anything Philistine at Beit Shan. Everything we have is Canaanite Egyptian or Egyptianized. And then later on, even in this period and after for sure, clearly a turn towards an Israelite site. So
Right.
so that part of the story, we can say with certainty, Saul's body and the bodies of his sons were taken to probably a Canaanite site or Canaanite Israelite site at Beit Shan. I have written in my notes some other details, because in some cases it could also be a reference to Rehov, because Beit Shan and Rehov are right next to each other, but we
Okay.
don't have to go into that. So let's go back to that other question. if Saul's sword is brought back to the Philistines, why? Like what's going on in that particular part of the story? So, with this in mind, I like fantasy literature, epic literature. I love the Iliad, the Odyssey, of course, Lord of the Rings, but just storytelling in general that uses weapons as story devices, as literary devices. And I think, and I'm not the only one to have recognized this in the book of Samuel, and specifically the rise of David. So if we go all the way back to Saul's initial interaction with the Philistines, we have a curious note where Saul is standing off against the Philistines, now, in this case, very close to his home in Benjamin. And Jonathan is with him as his commander. And after some initial skirmishes, the text says that the only two swords that were available to the Israelites were in the hand of Saul and in the hand of Jonathan, because the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines to sharpen their tools. Now, on the one hand, this remains unproven from an archaeological perspective, that the Philistines are stronger than the Israelites, or that they have this kind of monopoly on metallurgy. But what is clear in the early days of Israel and the Philistines is that there is this tug and pull, and it does seem, for at least a brief moment, that the Philistines do have the upper hand, which would mean they're stronger agriculturally, they're stronger militarily. And so this is another place where we could, try to make somebody's interpretation fit in with this particular text. But what the text is really indicating, if we just read it straightforwardly, is that the only people with agency in the narrative are Saul and Jonathan, because they're the ones that have swords in their hand. They're the ones
Right.
with kind of this
Right.
magical stuff. This is another thing that I think people don't really realize, is the creation of metal is not easy to imagine. like
Right.
watching someone take this lump of ore and then turn it into a tool or turn it into a weapon was considered to be, maybe rightly so, mystical or magical throughout the ancient world. And if you go to again, the Lord of the Rings, the remaking of Narsil, the Flame of the West for Aragorn, or if you go to Gilgamesh and you have Gilgamesh and Enkidu set on their conquest of Humbaba, they equip them with these newly freshly made weapons. And of course, even to Arthurian legend, the idea of Excalibur as this object that is not only imbued with some type of incantation and magical, but it also has a kind of character in itself. There's something going on with that particular weapon that's more than just material. And so I think that is what's happening here. And so in the story, you have Saul with his weapon, and you have Jonathan with their weapon. And Jonathan, because he's courageous, even though he's not the guy God's chosen to be the king, he's the real king because he has courage, and he defeats the Philistines. Whereas Saul is afraid to do so. He offers the sacrifice. He gives these rash vows. And at each instance where he should be able to pick up the sword, he fails to do so. And he has this kind of bumbling victory over chapters 13 and 14. And in chapter 15, with this Philistine sword, probably forged in Gath of the Philistines, or at least one of the Philistine cities, which, by the way, we often find metalworking in connection with temples at these sites, where we see weapons being worked on or tools being worked on. In 1 Samuel chapter 15, we find Saul going against the Amalekites, doing something he's supposed to do, killing in this really grisly scene where he's killing all of the Amalekites, but he leaves the the animals that are there as plunder for himself and richness for himself, and he also leaves their king Agag, um, who has killed Israelites, and the biblical text says that's the main guy you have to kill. And so
Right.
instead of killing him, Samuel has to come up to him, rebuke him, and say, the kingdom has gone elsewhere. He picks up the sword and he hacks Agag to pieces. Now, we could just read that story and be like, oh, yeah, this is weird, fun, cool. But the constant is the weapon. The weapon is this thing, like, this is the thing that gives them agency. And of course, 1 Samuel 16 is where we have the famous narrative of Samuel rejecting Saul, saying, I'm no longer going to see you anymore, and going to David, who becomes the man after God's own heart, which ultimately sets the stage for where we finally have the two swords, which we'll talk about here in a minute, 1 Samuel 17.
Yep. So you call this narrative the tale of the two swords. Can you explain a little bit more? Like, all right, why is this motif of the tale of the two swords so important to understanding 1 Samuel 13 through 31?
Yeah, I think that it's so important. I'll put it this way. Like, if you think of the story of, it's so important for a couple of reasons. One is that it ties the whole thing together in a way that is understandable, and it helps us visualize the things that are happening in a really clear way. And so I think there's several levels of importance. One is the biblical text is often negatively compared to things like Greek myth or the Iliad, the Odyssey, Gilgamesh, as not being as good of a storytelling. I think in this instance, this is one of the high peaks of storytelling. I think, Joseph's story also has a lot of this going on. And so I think there's just kind of this first awareness of, if this piece is here, and you also have this kind of point of view happening, changing at the end of the book, it shows that the literature is very high level. And it's also falling into what I'd almost consider to be kind of these ontological ways of telling these epic stories, right? Achilles has armor from Hephaestus that's prepared specifically for him to do this job, and that gets fought over for book after book in the Iliad. Like, it's a major story device. And so I just think the first thing is to say is that good stories that matter and that mean something, tend to have these different elements. And it doesn't really say anything about their historicity. It says something about good stories. Now, we have swords. We know the Philistines made them. We know the Israelites made them. But that's the first the first takeaway, I would say. The second takeaway is that it helps us imagine what an Israelite would be thinking when we have these different objects accompanying people when they go to these different locations. And this is actually one of the things that I am most interested by, is how the biblical story is being formed and told and retold before it's written. When you pass Gath of the Philistines, what are you talking about? You're talking about David acting like a crazy guy. You're talking about David serving the king, Achish. You're talking about, wow, that massive wall, look how big it is. It's just as tall as Goliath. Oh, Goliath is 6 cubits in a span. These parts of the story are, I don't know if we want to use the word realistic, but they are related to how people are forming and shaping these stories. And so
Right.
if you were to make a movie poster about 1 Samuel 13 through 31, the thing that would most qualify are these two crossed swords, the sword of Goliath and the sword of Saul. And just as a kind of an aside to this, I'm making a similar case for the bigger story, that this is only a sub part, and that's the story of the Ark. Because I think that the story of the Ark, if you think about, they bring the Ark from Shiloh, and earlier on in Samuel, it goes among the Philistines, it fights its own battles there, it's returning. So this wider story of God's presence among his people with the Ark and its different pieces is the bigger story that now David is being brought into. And of course, David himself is later going to have something to say about what happens with the ark. And so once again, we have these physical objects that are imbued in some sense with divine or mystical power, playing a
Right.
major role in the story. So all that takes us to is 1 Samuel 17. And in the story, everyone knows, and I think it's one of my favorite places to visit in all of Israel. I had the great privilege of spending many, many nights nearby, because that's where our excavation camp was when we dug at Tel Burna. Natif Halamed Hay, right where the battle would have happened, or near there anyway. We had the brook out front where we could get some smooth stones.
There you
And
go.
Saul goes to fight against the Philistines after they've come up between Socho and Azekah. And the Goliath, or the giant from Gath, Goliath, he shouts out for 40 days and 40 nights, Israel, send me a guy to fight with me. And it's a long narrative. In fact, the longest narrative we have in the book of Samuel, because it's really this peak moment. David, as Providence would have it, comes to visit his brothers, bringing them some food, and he hears the giant demeaning Saul, demeaning Israel, demeaning, of course, God himself. And he says, how come no one is doing anything about this? Now
Right.
he has the anointing. He's the man after God's own heart. He is the one who is the real king, even though he's the shepherd boy, probably 15, 16, a real Achilles era. And if you'll remember in the narrative, Saul's reluctant, but he says, okay, fine. If you're going to fight him, at least wear my armor. Now we think about that story and we think, okay, yeah, a fully grown man wearing a boy wearing a fully grown man's armor, but it's kind of odd that we would even have that detail. Like, maybe the only armor that exists, again, if we just read the text at face value, the only armor, the only sword that's there is David, or is Saul and Jonathan's. So the only means that Saul imagines that Goliath can ultimately be killed by is this weaponry, which, as I've argued, originates from the land of the Philistines. And so instead of the swords clashing, it says David tries it on. He hasn't tested it. And so he goes to face the giant alone as the representative of the one true God against the Philistine. Now, later on in the narrative, before we get to its real high point, we also learn that the other sword is there. So I like to call it the tale of two swords. But actually, at one point in the narrative, Jonathan, just as you go from 1 Samuel 17 to 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan is there with his own sword, and he's going to give it to David after the battle. So you have the sword of Saul, the sword of Goliath, and the sword of Jonathan all there. And now you also have the contrast of Saul. Here's my armor. You go fight the battle for me because I'm a coward. David says,
Right.
no, I don't need your stink. I'm going to fight it alone. After the
Right.
battle, Jonathan gives him his sword, which shows once again, Jonathan, just as he defeated the Philistines because he's God's man, he also is recognizing the Lord while he is in the way with him. This is like a Psalm 2, Psalm 110 kind of idea. But back to what, the story that everybody remembers, David is facing off against the Philistine. David picks up his 5 smooth stones. They have this really elegant trash talk back and forth. David is on the Lord's side. He lets one fly after saying, I'm going to remove your head without a sword in my hand. And it says it like 3 times. I'm going to cut your head off. There's no sword. It's like plain as day. The sword is like a big deal. Hits him in the
Right.
head, walks over, chops his head off. And I always there's no sounds in the biblical text, but the eruption after a silent moment of the thud must have been really impactful. And he accomplishes his mission of killing the giant, holding up the head as Israel chases the Philistines back to Gath and back to Ekron. And so again, within a very short area, right in the area between Israel and the Philistines, we have these three Philistine-made swords, the sword of Saul, the sword of Goliath, and the sword of Jonathan. And the rest of the narrative is going to continue to revolve around, especially the sword of Goliath and the sword of Saul. So, and this is where I think there's a curious note at the end of chapter 17, where it says that David took the armor of Goliath and put it in his tent, and he took the head to Jerusalem. And there is some issues with the text of 1 Samuel. It does seem that in general the Septuagint offers a more consistent reading, but it's also shorter than we have in the Masoretic text. And so we do have some questions about what exactly is going on, because it breaks off the flow. However, even though I do think that there are some potential textual issues, and even we see this in something like 1 Samuel 13, where Saul is, many translations have ... years old, and he reigned for 2 years. It's like, huh? Like that doesn't quite fit with what's going on. So there's some textual issues, but in the larger flow, it fits that David would have brought the sword of Goliath to Jerusalem. And this connection is going to come back a little bit later when he goes to Nob, which I believe is right next to Jerusalem. And this may also be a kind of clue as to something we already talked about with Beth Shean. The people of Beth Shean bringing the dead body to the Philistines, bringing it to Beth Shean, might be similar to David bringing the body of Goliath or the head of Goliath to Jerusalem, essentially like, you're next kind of thing. Like we got you in our sights, but I wouldn't be too dogmatic about that. What is clear is, if we read the whole text together, is that David brings the sword of Goliath and puts it in the tabernacle, which is at Nob. Now, that's a whole other discussion as to what happens to the tabernacle, because the tabernacle itself is essentially like disassembled, like all these Lego pieces, goes these different directions after the ark is lost. So the ark is lost to the Philistines, boom, 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 the different sites. It eventually finds its way at Kiryat Yearim. It's waiting for David to bring it to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem isn't conquered yet. We learned that the altar is at Gibeon, which is north of Jerusalem, west of Gibeah. The chronicler says this is the very altar that Moses had Bezalel make in the wilderness. And so there's a kind of tabernacle structure there. We can assume there's a kind of tent for the ark at Kiryat Yearim. And there's also a tent tabernacle that's set up at Nob, where we have the table of the bread of the presence and presumably the menorah and whatever else is there. This seems to be the tent that David brings the sword to. This also seems to have been the place where the priests remained. And so even though they don't have the Ark of the Covenant, they have the table of the bread of the presence, which is the thing that they're offering before the Lord. They also seem to have the ephod, which is the thing that allows you to ask questions to the deity. We don't really know what the Urim and the Tumim are or how they worked, but we do know that if you know how to use them, you can ask God what to do. And so those are located at Nob, which is like 3 miles from Gibeah, next to Jerusalem. And so this is where Saul takes the sword of Goliath. An important detail. So the sword of Goliath is there waiting, like at Rivendell with Elrond, waiting for Aragorn. And then David himself enters fully now into the service of Saul at Gibeah. And this is where we transition from, this heroic story of David and Saul as this heir apparent, or this nice relationship, to Saul having this spirit come upon him that is harmful to him. He's lost the anointing of the Holy Spirit, even though he still has that status. And so with this change, we don't really see Saul's sword appearing anymore until the very end of the story, which we already talked about. Instead, now it's the spear. He's trying to throw a spear at David a couple of times. We find the spear later on next to him while he is asleep, and David could have easily turned him into a shish kebab while he's lying asleep on the ground. And so his mental state is really deteriorating. The biblical text indicates that this is from the Lord. And even in later biblical interpretation, David, as someone who has the ability to play the harp, is part of how people think about him being able to drive out demons. And even in Qumran, there's a really interesting passage that says David wrote 3 psalms to have demons taken out because he plays the harp. So also, again, harp versus spear. Like there's these like really compelling props that are in the hands of these characters. Well, Saul, he's really 1 Samuel 18 for the next several chapters is all about Saul's usually clumsy plots at trying to kill David. Some of those are direct by throwing a spear at him. Others are, I'm going to kill him by using my my promise that he can marry one of my daughters and be kind of my son-in-law. I'm going to send him to the Philistines. Yeah, you can marry my daughter. The bride price is 100 foreskins of the Philistines. David's like, okay, no problem. Comes back with 200 foreskins. Who he kills these with, hard to say, but presumably Jonathan's sword, because he just received that in the previous chapter. Jonathan,
I got a question. I got a question now. What do they do with the? All right, so this is more of a ha question. What do you do with the foreskins, right? Like I won 104 foreskins. What are you doing with the foreskins after you get 200 of them?
Yeah. I mean,
you're like hanging them up and wearing them around your neck or something like a necklace.
Well, at a bris, for circumcisions in the Jewish community, they do kind of. I just remember even my, having kids myself, like with even the belly when the umbilical cord falls out, like so they're kind of a really grisly scene. I would say though that most likely what is not happening is a actual circumcision. What's actually being talked about is a full removal, because we do know from ancient texts, especially from Medinet Habu and in ancient Egypt, where the Philistines and others that fought against the Egyptians, when they were killed, the way that they counted them was either by cutting off a hand or cutting off a uncircumcised penis. And so there, we have depictions of mounds of hands or phalluses in that same vein. So we don't know. I mean, it's not exactly the thing that survives, but we actually found hands, not penises, but hands of removed from the same time period, from the the end of the late Bronze Age.
Wow.
Yeah, that are buried. So great question, and again, the kind of thing archaeology actually can tell us a little bit about because because the nature of the story. But yeah.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's the culture. It's the culture that blows my mind. Sometimes because it's so hard for us to read the Bible, read these stories, and right now we're recording in 2026. Yeah. So read this in a 2026 mindset and really trying to understand the value or what they were really trying to do. We see this with languages. We see this with different practices. So was just curious if you had any insight on that.
No, I would say even if we think about that, and I know it's gross, but the physicality of, again, in the narrative, whether we're talking about metal objects or the removal of body parts as a way of saying, here's what's going on in the story. I have it in front of me. But also, if you think of even a marriage in the ancient world, in ancient Israel, it requires a bride price. And how do you pay it? You can't just say, I killed all these guys. Here they are. Proof. Here's the proof. Yeah. You weren't there, Saul. And I'd say there's something similar, even in a narrative like Joseph with Jacob. Right? Joseph is dead. How do we know? Well, here's his bloody coat. Right? You have this kind of like proof of death or proof of life that both is realistic to someone actually having a question of if you're telling the truth or not. But
Gotcha.
also as an object, it's like, oh, like I can imagine what that coat would have looked like, or I can imagine maybe not what
Right.
these the foreskins would have looked like. I do think it's intentionally realistic, but it's also still intentionally a bit dark and humorous. So as the story goes on, David eventually marries Michal, the second daughter of Saul. Jonathan loves him. Michal loves him. Everyone loves David, but things are not going well for Saul. He realizes that if things continue, that he needs to that his situation is one that is not secure. So he decides that he is just going to kill him directly. He tries to seize him at night. This is another interesting one. When Michal has a teraphim, apparently an idol or a statue, put some goat hair on it. It's like the old trickaroo. And David's not David. David's out the window and
Oh
off
man.
in the off in the field. And Jonathan and he. This is that moment of covenant where again they shoot the arrows and they say, you know, I will be with you, whatever happens. I'm going to be faithful to my dad Saul, but I'm also going to be faithful to you. And this is where I actually think Jonathan's character is one of my favorite in the Bible, because he, like many of us, is not in an easy situation. He's you know, as a as the great character, what's his name, Lannister from Game of Thrones, the one who gets his hand. Well, I can't. What's his name?
Yeah, it was not Tyrant's the little one. Jamie Lannister. Yeah.
Jamie Lannister.
Right.
He has a great line where he's pulled between all these different directions, and he says, "They make you swear and swear and swear." Where one allegiance means you have to break the other allegiance. And it's actually these types of situations that we often find ourselves in the church, in politics, in families, in career. And it's realistic. And Jonathan is just trying to be true to the person who he sees is the anointed one in front of him, the man after God's own heart, that he is drawn to as just in true, genuine love at this moment, while he also has an allegiance to his father. How allegiant is he is to his father? Well, we already learned that he dies as a result of this. So it's fascinating glimpse into what true character is all about. In any case, David decides that he can't stick around. Saul is wondering where he is. He wants to kill him. He even throws the spear at Jonathan, again, indicating how insane he's become. So David, what does he do? He goes from Gibeah to Nob, just a few miles down next to Jerusalem. It's there that the priest, who is one of the descendants of Eli, one of the last descendants, Ahimelech, says, I know you're hungry, but I can't give you anything because this is the bread of the presence. And David says, you know, we've been kept chaste. So he allows him to eat it. Later on, Jesus would reflect on this same passage in the Gospels when they're eating from the grain growing by the field. And he says, listen, is there any weapon here? And he says, there's the sword of Goliath. And they go, that's the one I want. There's nothing like it. And so now David has the sword. And even though the text doesn't spell out what his plan is, it's really clear that his plan is to go to the Philistines, to hide among them as a kind of mercenary, so that while Saul is chasing them, he can seek asylum with the enemy. So it's that classic enemy versus my enemy is my friend. And so what ends up happening is David gets the sword of Goliath, now in his hand, which becomes this major weapon, and they flee. David hears about it, or excuse me, Saul hears about it because there is this character, Doeg, I believe it is, who is there. He sees what's happening. He tattletales on them. And then Saul immediately comes to Nob, the city of priests, takes out his sword once more and puts it to the edge of the sword, kills all the priests, everyone, man, woman, child, beast, the same thing he was supposed to do with the Amalekites, the enemies of Israel, he does to this Levitical priestly city. So it's just showing, again, but it's the sword that he does it with. He's
Right.
misusing his agency. Except Aviatar, the priest, he's got the ephod with him. He hightails it out of Nob, going down to meet David. So now Saul has, at this point, lost his marbles, lost the spirit, lost access to Samuel. He's also lost any access to the ephod, which is how he could ask basic questions of, should we do this or should we do that? So he is really on his own. All he has is himself, as well as this weapon to do things. And in each stage, it's not going to benefit him. So what happens next with David? David goes among the Philistines, and his plan doesn't work. He goes there, and they're like, "Oh, new theme song." It's like the Avengers, right? Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his 10,000s. The same song that drove Saul crazy is still playing in Gath of the Philistines. And we should stop here and say, Gath of the Philistines at this moment is an enormous city. I mean, it compared to Gibeah of Saul, which is a small hill, this is a metropolis, massive city, large fortress. And they seem to be welcoming David in, but David has cold feet. He acts like a lunatic with the drool dripping down his beard. Achish says, "Get him out. I don't need any crazy people here." So David then makes the conscious decision to hide exactly in the same valley where he fought the battle of against Goliath, between the forces of Israel and the forces of the Philistines, with the sword. And it's there at the fortress or the cave of Adullam that we have so many of what I like to think of as like the merry men of Robin Hood, which I actually think is the basis. This story is the basis for that legend. Join him, people that are Odettes or that are having a really difficult time. They all join around him. This is the beginning of the mighty men, David's family, Joab and his brothers, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. All of these guys join David at this time. They're a kind of a grassroots there, and so while he's there, and this is again showing the geography and showing how these stories think. Aviatar brings him the ephod while he is at the cave. And so now David, at this moment, he has the anointing of God's Spirit. He is the man of the hour. He has the sword of Goliath. He has his loyal followers who are going to be with him wherever he goes. But he is homeless. He can't go back to Gibeah. He can't go back to Bethlehem. He sends his parents away to Moab, similar to Saul, by the way. Saul with Jabesh Gilead. David has family in Moab, because remember the story of Ruth. And so now David is in a really transient situation at this point in the narrative. But he's got these resources and the things that really matter. And he's going to be given opportunities throughout this story to end it. That is to kill Saul. He's going to be given an opportunity when Saul comes to try to kill him, for instance, at En-Gedi. Another opportunity when he's asleep at Bethlehem. And in each instance, he says, "I will not put my hand out against the Lord's anointed." And that's where we get those lines about that have a payoff at the end of the story, because the Lord is going to cause this to happen. And I won't go into all the trials and travails. It's a fascinating study in itself. But there's I think two elements that are really important. One is actually the story of David with Abigail and Nabal. The only time that David straps on his sword to go kill someone in a hot anger is not with Saul. It's with this guy that's name is Fool, Nabal, in 1 Samuel 25. And Abigail stops him and says, "Look, you can't do this. This is unjust. Here's some raisins and some other things." And David's like, "Okay, you're right." And then God ends up killing this fool. He's struck dead after he hears what's happened. And so this is actually an important detail, how David is slowly winning the southern part of the hills, the area of Hebron, the area of Carmel, the area of Maon. Ziph is a place near Hebron. They tell on David twice to Saul, like, David's around, David's over here, you need to come get him. And so throughout this narrative, David has the sword. He's on the run from Saul. And at a certain point of time, he decides, I need to go back to plan A. Plan A is to go among the Philistines. If I go among the Philistines, I can have at least some semblance of peace. And so once that happens, David goes back to Gath of the Philistines with his Philistine sword, Goliath's sword, that's won now many battles, but never has reached out against Saul. And now David, over the course of the next couple of chapters, but especially 1 Samuel 26 and 27, he's fighting Israel's enemies and the Philistines' enemies. This is where it gets really interesting, because David is killing the Amalekites. He's defeating these peoples that no one seems to really like, and he's sending spoil to Gath, but he's also sending it to others among the people of Israel, and specifically Judah, that are going the people that support him in the war. And so all is going swimmingly. He's got this cover from Saul by being with the Philistines, with Achish of Gath. But then he gets the news that there is a muster for all of the Philistines to come up with their mercenaries. And David, of course, is a mercenary for Achish. And it says the Seranim, the lords of the Philistines, which seems to be a Philistine word, maybe even related to the Greek word tyrant. And they muster at a place called Aphek, northeast of Tel Aviv today. And David, true to form, goes there, and he's like, man, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm on this path now. I got my Philistine sword with me, and let's do it. Luckily, or providentially, Achish demands and says, he's done all this stuff for me. He's proven himself time and time again. He's going to fight for us. He's not going to turn against us when Saul's on the battlefield. Saul's, his worst enemy. But God providentially has the other four lords say, look, we can't risk it. So David then turns around after being at Aphek, which is in the area of the coastal plain, and goes as far south as possible. He goes all the way to Ziklag, which is, there's debate, but I think it's west of Beersheba. So Dan to Beersheba, those are the borders of the country. So while he's there, that he realizes that his city has been attacked, his family has been taken, and the city has been burned. And so not only is he going to go to the edge of the habitable area, he's going to go beyond that to chase the Amalekites, to kill them, to recap. I mean, it's like a cowboy, movie of going as far west as possible. It's like Searchers or something, a John Wayne film. And so he's getting incrementally further and further and further away from the action. And so that's the backdrop to where David is when Saul's death actually happens. And so if we put all that together, then think about how all three swords emerged from most likely Gath of the Philistines, the most important city of the time, where probably in connection with the temple of Dagon or Ashtaroth or some temple where this is happening. David has brought the sword back after Goliath was made there. He's fought all these battles. Saul's sword has never come against the Philistines to fight them on their own turf, but it ends up doing all of these things throughout the narrative. They show up together in 1 Samuel 17, but the sword and his head are brought back to the place where they were made at the end of the narrative, with Saul's sword at that particular place. And again, think about how that also compares to the ark being brought to the house of Dagon.
Right.
This is my trophy. This is what I've accomplished. This is what is going on. And so that's like, if we see the swords from 1 Samuel 13 all the way to 31, we see that it is the story device, the literary device that ties the whole things together. It imagines, for an Israelite who, they know these places, but they can imagine an object going to Gath, going against the Amalekites, going to Gilboa, and it becomes this story that's really, really tangible and extremely well told. And so from then on, we learn, that David is, of course, going to have his rise and eventually become king over all of Israel, and the Philistines are going to attack him. The last point I want to make about this is, interestingly enough, this was recognized early in affected biblical history. This idea of these heroic swords. Judah the Hammer didn't have a hammer; that was just a nickname. He has a sword that he takes off a Seleucid general that he kills, and the text goes out of its way in First Maccabees to say he carried this sword with him for the rest of his days, and it's a clear allusion to what David does with the sword of Goliath. And so anyway, that's the tale of two swords. There's more, obviously, we could say. I know we're over time, but it's and it only works. It only opens up really if we see that final battle with the head and the sword being brought from the battlefield back to the land of the Philistines. Right. Because that then gives the symmetry of where it was created, it comes back to.
Right. Man, Dr. McKinny, this has been great, man. You really brought this story to life. Can you tell us more about the Tale of Two Swords and how people could get a hold of you, find your projects that you're working on? That would be fantastic.
Yeah. So this is something I'm still working on. This I wrote it several years ago and need to publish it. I always talk about it in the field. I'm currently at the Lanier Center for Archaeology at Lipscomb University. So this is the exact kind of stuff that we talk about and get into in classes. The Lanier Center for Archaeology is a leading center for the study of biblical archaeology in the United States, really one of the only places that you can get an MA and a PhD from an accredited institution. And I'm really happy to be there. We have several projects that we're working on. Ashdod, where the Ark was brought, Ashdod of the Philistines, Karnak in Egypt, greatest temple that's in existence of the ancient world. We have a project there. I'm joining a project on the Sea of Galilee upcoming this summer at El Araj, the site of Bethsaida, home of Simon Peter and Andrew and Philip and maybe some other disciples. Pretty important site. And then the other thing I'd say, two other things is, we have a podcast called Biblical World Podcast, where we discuss exactly these types of topics all the time. We just finished this long series on Gilgamesh, which was a lot of fun. And perhaps the most important thing for your listeners is I have a movie coming out in exactly 1 month from today. So we're in early March, and in April 12th, 14th, and 15th, the film Legends of the Lost Ark will be premiering in theaters. So it's a documentary about what happened to the Ark according to the most ancient sources. And so it's what I like to call it is a kind of love letter to biblical archaeology, historical geography, because we really delve into what does the text actually say? What did ancient Judeans who lost the Ark, how did they grapple with this? It's shot in Israel on location. We also have lots of reenactments of biblical scenes of Jeremiah, Moses. We actually made an ark. So it's a really exciting to see this come to fruition. So definitely check it out if you have some time. LegendsoftheLostArk.com is where you can get more information about it.
Oh, nice. I'll make sure I link all that stuff in the bio here on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, so people could check it out. But Dr. McKinny, thank you so much for joining us today. Man, really fascinating stuff, and looking forward to connecting again in the future for sure.
Great. Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In Podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.